Waylon Jennings may have been a country music legend, but he was never one to follow the Nashville rulebook. A true outlaw in every sense of the word, he carved his own path, battling addiction, defying the music industry, and dodging more than a few brushes with the law. His life was a constant fight, but through sheer grit, rebellion, and sheer luck, he managed to survive it all. From narrowly escaping a doomed plane crash to burning through an astonishing $1,500 a day on drugs, Jennings lived on the edge. Somehow, despite pushing the limits time and time again, he managed to beat the odds and tell his story, though just barely. That fearless attitude was ingrained in him from the start. Jennings embodied the brash confidence of a Texan, something he acknowledged himself. When you're born in Texas, you think that you're a little bit taller, a little bit smarter, and a little bit tougher than anybody else. Born on June 15th, 1937 to farm laborers Lorene and William Jennings, he was raised in the small town of Littlefield, Texas. His family worked the land, scraping by on whatever they could earn from cotton farming. Though money was tight, his childhood was filled with the independent spirit that would later define both his music and his persona. That Texas swagger would serve him well throughout his career, but it would also land him in plenty of trouble. Despite his family's struggles, Jennings showed early signs of musical talent. When he was just 8 years old, his mother scraped together enough money to buy him a second-hand guitar. She taught him to play 30 pieces of silver, and from that moment on, he was hooked. His passion for music grew quickly. He began performing at local gatherings, and his natural talent earned him a spot on a TV talent show, which he won. By the time he was 14, he had his own weekly 30-minute radio show, an incredible feat for someone his age. It was clear that music was his calling, but while his star was rising in one area of his life, another was rapidly falling apart. Jennings had no love for school, and the rigid structure of the classroom never suited his rebellious nature. Discipline was harsh back then, with public paddlings being a common form of punishment. One day when the principal came toward him with a paddle, Jennings decided he had had enough. In a bold act of defiance, he grabbed the paddle right out of the stunned man's hands. True to form, he didn't stop there. Staring down the principal, Jennings declared that he was going to do the paddling instead. His confidence must have been convincing because what followed was an intense 2-hour standoff. The situation only ended when the school's football coach intervened. Shortly after that, the superintendent, likely fed up with Jennings's antics, pulled him aside and suggested that he leave school for good. At just 16 years old, Jennings walked away from formal education forever, setting himself on the road to becoming one of country music's most rebellious and legendary figures. Waylon Jennings's father didn't try to stop him from dropping out of school. Instead, he offered some tough love, telling him, "If you're smart enough to quit school, you're smart enough to work." And work he did. In what would be one of the first times Jennings unknowingly dodged disaster, he credited his father's insistence on hard labor with keeping him out of trouble. While other dropouts in Littlefield were finding trouble, Jennings was too exhausted from long hours doing grueling, dead-end jobs. The experience only strengthened his determination. He knew he needed a way out of Littlefield, and he was going to find it. Jennings realized that his escape route was right in his hands, his guitar. He didn't need formal lessons or music theory to know that playing was his way forward. Ironically, despite his raw talent, he had once been expelled from music class for lack of musical ability, but he didn't let that stop him. He poured everything he had into his music, playing as if his life depended on it, because in many ways it did. His relentless passion soon began paying off, opening doors that a kid from a small Texas town could have only dreamed of. His talent didn't go unnoticed. Jennings secured regular gigs at a local country radio station, where his deep, commanding voice caught the attention of listeners. He also landed a job as a DJ in Lubbock, Texas, spinning records and soaking in the music scene. It wasn't just his career that was taking off, his personal life was too. At just 18 years old, he married his first wife, Maxine Carroll Lawrence. For the first time, Jennings felt like he was moving forward, finally breaking free from the small-town life he had wanted so desperately to leave behind. But just when he thought things couldn't get any better, fate had an even bigger surprise in store. Working in music meant Jennings was constantly surrounded by artists, but one encounter changed his life forever. Among the many musicians he met, one saw something special in him, none other than Buddy Holly, the rising rock and roll star from Lubbock. Holly was immediately drawn to Jennings's unique voice and raw authenticity. He told him, "The way you sing, there's no limit," and decided to take the young Texan under his wing. But there was just one problem. Jennings wasn't exactly star material just yet. At the time, Jennings didn't have the polished look of a performer destined for the spotlight. His radio colleagues were embarrassed by his shaggy haircut, rumpled clothes, and the fact that he seemed to wear the same shirt all week. Holly saw past the rough edges and took it upon himself to refine Jennings's image, giving him a much-needed style upgrade. By the time Holly was finished, Jennings was nearly unrecognizable. With his new look and growing confidence, he was ready to step into the world of professional music. But just as everything seemed to be falling into place, tragedy loomed on the horizon, one that would change Jennings's life forever. Recognizing Jennings's raw talent, Holly took him under his wing, booking him a recording session and offering him a spot on his upcoming winter dance party tour. But there was one problem. Jennings had never played bass. That didn't stop Holly. As Jennings later recalled, "I couldn't have been more surprised when Buddy walked into the station one day, pitched me an electric bass guitar and said, 'You have 2 weeks to learn to play that thing.'" With no formal training, Jennings had to teach himself on the fly, but he wasn't about to let this chance slip away. Despite his inexperience, Holly saw something in Jennings that others didn't. Jennings himself admitted he was green as a gourd when it came to playing in a professional band, but Holly was confident he'd catch up. Soon, Jennings was part of Holly's touring lineup, joining other rising stars on the winter dance party circuit. It seemed like a dream come true, but reality hit hard once the tour began. The road was far from glamorous, and Jennings quickly realized that life on tour was more grueling than he had imagined. The winter dance party tour was relentless, with 25 shows scheduled back-to-back, leaving no time for rest. The musicians traveled across the frozen Midwest in an unheated bus, driving for hours through treacherous winter conditions on poorly maintained rural roads. The brutal cold was unbearable, and when the bus inevitably broke down, Jennings and his fellow performers were left stranded in sub-zero temperatures. Many of them, including the Big Bopper, developed severe cases of the flu, and some even suffered frostbite. With exhaustion setting in and the conditions worsening, something had to give. Frustrated with the miserable travel situation, Holly decided to take matters into his own hands. In an era long before private jets and luxury tour buses, he made a bold decision. He chartered a small plane for himself, his guitarist, and Jennings. The plan was simple: avoid another brutal overnight bus ride, arrive at the next venue well rested, and finally get some relief from the relentless cold. But fate had other plans. As word spread about the chartered flight, other musicians began asking for a seat. The Big Bopper, who was suffering badly from the flu, approached Jennings and pleaded for his spot. Jennings, sympathetic to his condition, agreed to give up his seat, telling him, "If it's okay with Buddy, it's okay with me." Meanwhile, across the room, another of Holly's band members, Tommy Alsup, lost a coin toss to Richie Valens, securing Valens the last available seat on the plane. No one could have known that this simple exchange would change music history forever. In the early hours of February 3, 1959, the small plane carrying Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, and the Big Bopper crashed into a frozen field in Iowa, killing everyone on board. It was a tragedy that would later be remembered as the day the music died. Jennings, who had unknowingly escaped death that night, would carry the weight of that moment for the rest of his life. The next morning, as the Winter Dance Party tour bus arrived in Moorhead, Minnesota, the surviving musicians were exhausted and frozen from another brutal ride. While they tried to warm up, the tour manager stepped into the hotel to check in, but moments later he came rushing back out. His face said it all. Something was very wrong. Jennings barely had time to react before Holly's guitarist went inside to get more information. When he returned, he delivered the news that would change Jennings' life forever. Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, and the Big Bopper had died in a plane crash. The weight of the tragedy was crushing. Losing his friend and mentor, along with his fellow tour mates, Jennings couldn't imagine picking up his guitar again. But the agency managing the tour gave the remaining musicians a harsh ultimatum: either finish the tour or go unpaid. Forced to push through his grief, Jennings went back on stage, but the music felt hollow. Once the tour ended, he returned to his old DJ job at the radio station in Lubbock. But he was a different man. The high-energy, wild man personality that had made him a standout was gone. "I was empty, drained of hope," he later admitted. And as if that wasn't enough, his personal life was beginning to fall apart too. Jennings wasn't just grieving, he was haunted. The crash that took Buddy Holly's life wasn't just a tragedy for him. It felt like a cruel twist of fate. He hadn't just given up his seat to the Big Bopper. His last conversation with Holly had ended in a joke that would torment him for years. The night before the crash, Holly had teased Jennings about staying behind on the freezing tour bus instead of flying. "I hope your damn bus freezes up again," Holly had joked. In response, Jennings shot back with a playful but fateful remark: "Well, I hope your plane crashes." When news of the accident broke, Jennings, a deeply superstitious Southern boy, was overwhelmed with guilt. Though logically he knew his words had nothing to do with the tragedy, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had somehow cursed his friend. It was a burden that weighed heavily on him for the rest of his life. While Jennings was spiraling internally, his home life wasn't any better. One night he came home late to a shocking sight: his wife Maxine standing on a chair with a necktie around her neck tied to a light bulb fixture. The moment he walked in, she jumped. The bulb shattered and she crashed to the floor. Jennings, surprisingly unfazed, dismissed it as one of Maxine's twisted jokes. But the truth was, their marriage was unraveling. Despite knowing they weren't meant to be together, they continued having children. In 1960, their third child was born. In a heartbreaking tribute to the friend he had lost, Jennings named his son Buddy. As Jennings tried to support his growing family, life only became more difficult. When Maxine's father fell seriously ill, they packed up and moved to Arizona to be closer to him. Jennings bounced between radio stations trying to make ends meet, but nothing seemed to last. He was lost, drifting without direction, until he finally found the courage to return to the one thing that had always saved him: music. Stepping back on stage, he took the first step toward rebuilding his life, setting the stage for the legendary outlaw country career that lay ahead. Once again, music gave Waylon Jennings an escape, this time from his crumbling marriage to Maxine. Life on the road had always been filled with temptation, but one night in a smoky club, he walked straight into trouble. Of all the honky-tonks in all the towns, He ended up at Lynn's, a bar owned by a fiery, no-nonsense older woman who didn't just hire him to play. She quickly became something much more. Their connection was immediate, and before long things heated up fast. Jennings had been unfaithful before, and Maxine likely knew what went on when he was away on tour, but this time was different. What he thought was just another fleeting affair turned into something much more serious. Jennings later admitted that Lynn was great in bed and had him by the yin-yang on a downhill pull. He was caught up in the thrill of it all, completely unaware that his wife, who was now pregnant with their fourth child, was about to turn his world upside down. Somehow, Maxine managed to get the phone number to Lynn's apartment, and when Lynn answered the call, everything came crashing down. Despite the chaos in his personal life, Jennings refused to let anything slow down his career. By the mid-1960s, he had divorced Maxine, married Lynn, and moved to Nashville, ready for a fresh start. It was there that he recorded his debut album, Folk Country, officially launching the next phase of his musical journey. It was an incredibly productive time for Jennings, and he seemed unstoppable. But there was another reason for his high-energy lifestyle, one that would soon take a dangerous turn. Shortly after arriving in Nashville, Jennings found himself sharing a tiny one-bedroom apartment with none other than Johnny Cash. Cash, already deep into his own struggles, was popping amphetamines like candy, and it didn't take long for Jennings to follow suit. He later boasted, "I prided myself on the fact that I could take more pills, stay up longer, sing more songs, and screw more women than most anybody you ever met." The drugs kept him going, fueling his long recording sessions and wild nights. Unfortunately for Lynn, Cash wasn't the only person Jennings was getting close to. After 5 years of marriage, Jennings' relationship with Lynn was falling apart, and it was entirely his fault. While still technically married, he had secretly started seeing another woman, Barbara, a tall blonde who also happened to be the daughter of a millionaire. He was so infatuated that he moved her into an apartment just down the hall from where he and Johnny Cash lived. When his divorce was finalized, he wasted no time making Barbara his new wife. Her father, eager to ensure his daughter's happiness, offered Jennings anything he wanted. But there was just one problem. What Barbara wanted most was something Jennings couldn't give. Waylon Jennings was never built for a quiet, settled life. Fidelity had never been his strong suit. His third wife, Barbara, tried to keep him in check, but Jennings was a force of nature. To make matters worse, Barbara had the means to fight back in ways most wives couldn't. On one particularly wild night while touring with Hank Williams Jr., Jennings had mixed so many uppers and downers that he became completely unhinged. Loretta Lynn, witnessing his state, had to physically march him around backstage in an attempt to sober him up. But even in a drug-fueled haze, Jennings wasn't about to pass up a good time. That night he took a woman back to his room, assuming she was just another fan looking for some after-hours fun. What he didn't realize was that he had just walked straight into a trap. Barbara wasn't naive. She had a feeling her husband was cheating, and she was determined to prove it. Instead of waiting for him to slip up, she hired a private investigator to go undercover. That supposed groupie Jennings had charmed? She was actually a detective sent by Barbara to catch him in the act. Once she had the evidence she needed, she didn't hold back. Enraged, she shredded Jennings's only rhinestone suit and smashed one of his prized guitars against the wall. Their fights were getting worse by the day. Barbara wanted him to slow down, settle into a stable home life, and give up his reckless ways. But Jennings made it clear that wasn't an option. "I wasn't about to stop playing guitar to keep my home life together," he later admitted. With no way to reconcile their differences, marriage number 3 came to a fiery end. And with that, Jennings fully embraced the chaos. In his own words, he went wild. The next chapter of his life was nothing short of mayhem. Fueled by an endless supply of pills, Jennings spent his days and nights lost in a whirlwind of music, drugs, and women. At the height of his excess, he was reportedly taking up to 30 amphetamines a day, going for days without sleep. His appetite for partying was insatiable. One particularly notorious night in Louisville, Jennings had women stashed in different hotel rooms on 3 separate floors. Running purely on adrenaline and chemicals, he spent the night sprinting up and down the emergency staircase, bouncing between them like a man on a mission. But even Jennings had limits. The nonstop drug use, sleepless nights, and endless cycle of partying were starting to take a toll. His once lean frame had dwindled down to just 138 pounds, 62 kilograms, and he later admitted that he was bent on self-destruction. His reckless lifestyle was catching up with him. Just when it seemed like he was heading toward a breaking point, something, or rather someone, intervened. In 1969, Jennings met singer Jessie Coulter, and everything changed. He later called her the best thing that ever happened to me. The two quickly fell in love and got married the same year. If anyone thought Jennings would stay single for long, they didn't know him very well. For the first time, Jennings had a wife who didn't see his music as a threat. She was part of the same world. Together, they became country music's most dynamic couple, recording duets and even earning a Grammy nomination in 1970 for their rendition of Suspicious Minds. It seemed like Jennings had finally met his match, someone who understood his passion for music and could keep up with his wild spirit. But while their love was real, their struggles were far from over. Waylon Jennings had always been committed to his music, but years of hard living were finally catching up to him. The relentless touring, the late nights, and the drugs had taken a toll on his body. Eventually, he was hospitalized with hepatitis, leaving him bedridden with far too much time to think. As he lay there, he took stock of his life. After a decade of grinding it out on the honky-tonk circuit, he was sick, drowning in debt, thanks in part to 3 divorces and alimony payments, and now had the IRS breathing down his neck. The dream was turning into a nightmare. Jennings was on the verge of giving up, ready to walk away from it all and go back to DJing. But then, his drummer came up with an idea that changed everything. Jennings left the hospital with a new mission: to finally break free from the constraints of Nashville's music industry. His drummer's advice was simple: embrace a rock and roll attitude. Jennings had always loved country music, but he had no patience for the rigid expectations of the Nashville establishment. He despised the rhinestone suits, the meddling producers who tried to polish his sound, and the record labels that controlled his career while keeping most of the profits. If he was going to make music, it would be on his own terms. If Jennings's life were a movie, this would be the moment where we flash back to Buddy Holly's advice: don't ever let them tell you what to do, and never put limits on yourself. Don't back up. Those words stuck with him. With a rebellious spirit, a cutthroat new manager, and the unwavering support of Jessie Coulter, Jennings was finally ready to take control of his destiny. He wasn't just going to change his own career. He was about to change country music forever. His manager fought hard to negotiate a better deal, securing Jennings more creative freedom and a bigger paycheck than he had ever received before. And the gamble paid off. In June 1974, he released This Time, which became his first #1 hit. Suddenly, Jennings wasn't just another country singer. He was a bona fide superstar. His signature look, dark sunglasses, a bushy beard, and a wide-brimmed black hat, became instantly recognizable. He had done it his way, proving that country music could have an outlaw edge. But with success came new temptations. Just as Jennings was finally breaking free from the industry's grip, another dangerous force took hold of him: His drummer, Richie Albright, had a plan to get him off amphetamines by introducing him to something stronger, cocaine. As comedian Robin Williams once joked, cocaine is God's way of saying you're making too much money. For Jennings, that couldn't have been more true. When Wanted, The Outlaws, featuring Jennings, Jesse Coulter, Willie Nelson, and Tom Paul Glazer, became the first country album to sell over 1 million copies. Jennings's fame skyrocketed. But with that success came an expensive new habit. As Jennings later admitted, I liked it. For the next 10 years, I liked it. What started as a way to keep up with his grueling schedule quickly spiraled into something far more destructive. Waylon Jennings's cocaine habit had spiraled out of control, draining his bank account at an alarming rate. At its peak, his addiction was costing him a staggering $1,500 a day. Everyone around him knew he had a problem, including law enforcement. In 1977, during a recording session, Jennings received a package from his manager. The moment he peeked inside, he knew exactly what it was, his expected shipment of cocaine. But this time, there was a serious problem. Jennings set the package down and went back to recording, but suddenly, he heard something strange in his headphones. The sound engineer had accidentally left the talkback button pressed, allowing Jennings to overhear an unexpected conversation. Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA agents had just arrived, and they were saying they had tracked a suspicious package containing contraband. Jennings, always quick on his feet, knew he had to act fast. In a split-second move, he made what would become one of the most legendary tosses in country music history, discreetly ditching the package right under the noses of federal agents. But he wasn't out of trouble just yet. A true outlaw never loses his cool, and Jennings played it perfectly. Sitting in the soundproof booth, he knew the agents had no idea he could hear them. Instead of panicking, he did the most Waylon thing possible. He carried on with the recording session, playing even louder just to mess with them. And in true outlaw fashion, he ended up using that exact take on his album. Meanwhile, the DEA agents, convinced they had him cornered, were about to make a critical mistake. The DEA had been so confident in their operation that they got careless. In their rush to bust Jennings, they had made a rookie error. The search warrant they carried had the wrong address. Legally, they could only search Jennings's office, but the package had been sent to the recording studio instead. While the agents stood around helplessly, waiting for an updated warrant, Jennings seized the opportunity. A few moments later, they heard the sound of a toilet flushing, and just like that, their evidence had disappeared, literally going down the drain. The drug bust turned into a media circus, with Jennings at the center of it all. For months, the court case dragged on, costing him $100,000 in legal fees. But in the end, the DEA had nothing on him, and the charges were dropped. Jennings, always one to turn misfortune into opportunity, took full advantage of the publicity. He even wrote a song about the ordeal, "Don't You Think This Outlaw Bit's Done Got Out of Hand," which became a hit. However, even escaping the DEA wasn't enough to slow him down. Despite the close call, Jennings continued his hard-living ways with no intention of giving up the drugs that fueled his lifestyle. In 1979, Waylon Jennings took his unmistakable Southern drawl and DJ background to a whole new level as the narrator of The Dukes of Hazzard. He once described the show as a moonshine excuse for car chases and watching Catherine Bach's behind in cut-off jeans. His voice fit the role so perfectly that the producers asked him to write and perform the theme song. The result was Good Ol' Boys, which became not only the show's signature tune, but also the biggest hit of Jennings's career. While his career was thriving, his personal life was unraveling. Jesse Coulter, his wife, had watched him battle addiction for years, but she knew she couldn't force him to quit. His drug use was no longer just a personal vice. It was starting to affect his music. He began hearing things that weren't there, his instincts dulled, and his once legendary creative spark was fading. But it wasn't until an incident involving their 3-year-old son, Shooter, that Jennings finally hit rock bottom. By 1984, Jennings had been given more than one second chance in life. Having narrowly escaped Buddy Holly's doom plane years before, but nothing shook him quite like what happened next. Despite his attempts to keep his drug use hidden, little Shooter stumbled upon one of his father's straws and started mimicking him, sniffing from it. Jennings was horrified. In that instant, he knew he had to make a change. That moment, more than any warning from doctors or pleas from loved ones, pushed him to seek help and finally kick his addiction. However, even after getting clean, Jennings wasn't one to avoid controversy. In 1985, during the recording of We Are the World, he made headlines for all the wrong reasons. More than 45 of the world's biggest musicians had gathered to record a charity single to support famine relief in Africa. When Stevie Wonder suggested incorporating Swahili lyrics into the song, Jennings reportedly scoffed, "No good old boy sings in Swahili." With that, he walked out of the studio. Though the final version of the song didn't include Swahili, Jennings's name still appeared in the credits. Whether or not he ever returned to finish recording remains a mystery. Regardless, We Are the World became a massive success, raising over $80 million for humanitarian aid. Meanwhile, Jennings's career and his health began to decline. Though he had conquered his drug addiction, Jennings replaced one vice with another. He began chain-smoking, burning through an astonishing 7 packs of cigarettes a day. His eating habits weren't much better. His meals consisted of 3 grilled cheese sandwiches for lunch, a dozen refried donuts for a snack, and all the chicken-fried steak, biscuits, and gravy he could devour. While he had been clean for 4 years, his new lifestyle was catching up to him fast. Eventually, his body couldn't take the abuse anymore. Jennings narrowly avoided a heart attack, but ended up needing quadruple bypass surgery. When he woke up from the operation, he was shocked to see Johnny Cash by his side. But Cash wasn't just visiting. He was in bad shape himself. Doctors took one look at him, ran some tests, and immediately scheduled him for an emergency bypass surgery of his own. During their recovery, the two country legends found humor in the situation, laughing about how fame meant nothing when you were stuck wearing a backless hospital gown. But the health scares didn't stop there. Years of hard living had taken their toll. In addition to heart problems, Jennings was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. By 2000, the pain in his leg had become unbearable, forcing him to stop touring. Surgery didn't improve his circulation, and in 2001, doctors had no choice but to amputate his foot. The man who had once outrun the law and lived life at full speed was now facing a battle he couldn't win. Despite his declining health, Jennings's legacy was undeniable. In 2001, he was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame, an honor that recognized his incredible influence on the genre. Sadly, he was too ill to attend the ceremony. Just a few months later, on February 13, 2002, Jennings passed away in his sleep from complications related to diabetes. Waylon Jennings was a force of nature, raw, rebellious, and undeniably talented. He changed country music forever, but his wild lifestyle eventually caught up with him. Even in his final days, he remained true to himself, refusing to conform or compromise. His legacy lives on in the music, in the stories, and in the outlaw spirit that continues to inspire artists today. What's your favorite Waylon Jennings song? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this look into his life, be sure to like, subscribe, and check out our next video on another music legend. Thanks for watching.